Coming up, a conversation with Brian Risley, candidate for an at-large seat on Colorado Springs City Council.
This is 6035 Media.
Casting an informed vote is your right and your duty as a citizen. I'm Brian Grossman, executive editor of Sixty35.
And I'm Julie Ott, communication lead for the League of Women Voters of the Pikes Peak Region.
And we're teaming up to bring you conversations with the candidates in the April 2023 Colorado Springs city election. This interview is both an episode of the new Sixty35 Vote podcast
and the League's Making Democracy Work podcast. So let's get to it. Brian, will you take 2 minutes to introduce yourself?
I'd be glad to. Born and raised here in Colorado Springs, grew up in the Black Forest area. I own a locally based architecture firm. We specialize in planning and design of primarily commercial facilities, lots of schools and churches and things of that nature. I've got a 13-year-old daughter here in town, and my wife works for Kaiser Permanente as a software developer, and I've been involved in a lot of different aspects of the community in my time here in Colorado Springs, and looking forward to seeing what the next chapter holds.
That was fast. Why don't we have another minute on why you're running?
Sure.
Yeah.
So again, being a native of Colorado Springs, I've seen how things have changed and evolved here in our community over a fairly long span of time. I've seen the good times, the not so good times. I've seen some great decisions and some questionable ones. I've been involved in serving on a lot of different boards and committees and in a lot of different volunteer modes. And I feel like this is a very pivotal point for the future of Colorado Springs, obviously with 4 city council members and a new mayor. And I've had my arm twisted in prior years to jump in, but this really feels right, both in terms of where my family is, where my business is, and where we are as a community. My goal is really to try to continue helping make some good decisions moving forward.
Okay. Brian, let's start with a question that involves water and development. What's your stand on the 128% water rule, sort of finalized yesterday as far as extending water and other utilities to flagpole annexed developments?
Well, in my professional world, as well as the current chair of the El Paso County Planning Commission, I see a lot of the nuances in what was enacted yesterday. And I see a lot of the issues, both from the perspective of developers as well as the perspective of residents in the community. I don't know enough about how the 128% was derived. So I can't really speak to the specifics of that. I think generally having some clear guidelines on how we determine water sufficiency and water resources is very important. I think, as with most items, having a very robust public process is really critical. I question whether there was a robust public process here. I think most people would say there was not. I think understanding how that impacts not just a particular developer, but our community in general is really critical. When you start to restrict or maybe limit the way growth occurs, you also start to talk about housing affordability and attainability. You start to talk about economic vitality. And I think balancing all of that is really critical. You mentioned flagpole annexations. Again, those are sort of policy issues that become very entwined in a lot of different aspects of community. Flagpole annexations on their face happen all the time. That's not necessarily a litmus test for whether it's good for the community or bad for the community. And again, we're talking about an issue that's bigger than just one development, that's bigger than just one developer, and being very intentional and mindful about how we make these decisions, in my opinion, is the most critical piece.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, so as a follow-up to that, should the city consider extending water or other utilities to subdivisions located outside the city that might never be annexed as part of maybe a regional water provider?
So the conversation about a regional water system and whether CSU is suited to be a regional water provider has been discussed, at quite a great length between city and county agencies. The root of the issue there is sort of twofold. Philosophically, if a water district outside of Falcon runs out of water, what do we do as a community? Do we turn our back on our neighbors and say, well, you made a bad decision in terms of where you developed and choose to live? Or do we as a community figure out how to maybe correct some of those things? The big issue, as I see it, is that if we know that growth is going to happen, we know that one way or the other development will take place. If we aren't mindful about that, a development would occur in the county instead of in the city. And in the county, largely, those developments are fed by non-renewable water. So in the city, CSU has done a great job of being very looking forward into the future and identifying resources that are renewable water resources. So in my personal opinion, I think it makes more sense to see development happen in a municipality that has the ability to harness renewable water resources as opposed to non-renewable. And, in terms of serving outside of the CSU boundary, that's another discussion I think that has to happen at the CSU level. The other thing that factors into all of this, again, is just the interface between the city and the county. And so the notion of development in the county or in some other surrounding jurisdiction, the MOU that was put in place last year between the city of Colorado Springs and El Paso County to allow development to occur in the county per the city standards is a really critical piece to understanding how we knit together urban growth in, if you will, a rural, quote unquote, region of the county. So it's a very complex issue, and it all sort of, again, ties together.
This is a residential property rights question. Where do you stand on accessory dwelling units being allowed in single-family residential areas?
Generally speaking, I feel pretty strongly about the rights of property owners to do what they wish to do within the confines of the Land Development Code. I think that the idea of ADUs begins to speak to or address housing affordability, attainability. It creates the opportunity for density, but I also think it has to be done in a pretty controlled and smart way. I think, again, having some robust public discussions around what that looks like, how that gets implemented, what the sort of purpose of the additional dwelling units really wants to be. I think we need to have some bounds around how that gets played out from a true use standpoint. We see a lot of situations where somebody builds an apartment on their property that's intended for residential use and ends up being used for some commercial purpose, which may not be bad as long as it's compatible with the surrounding community. To me, when we look at all those things, it's about that context and again, what ultimately is the right answer for the community in general.
A league issue that we have been supportive of in the past is increasing city council pay, since the current amount does not allow for many members of our community to run for the office, except for retirees. Do you support an increase in city council pay, and why or why not?
Well, as a person who is still working full time, I certainly understand that restriction, if you will. I think it really comes down to why does somebody want to run for city council? Why does somebody want to serve in that capacity? From my lens, the reason why I'm doing this is clearly not for the pay. I'm not doing this for the notoriety. I'm not doing this for the ability to bring a spotlight or attention to myself. I'm doing it because I truly care about this community and I want to help make some great decisions for our community. I think if you incentivize that with pay, yes, it does potentially open up the spectrum of folks that can serve. But the downside is then I think you've got folks that are chasing that as a full-time job. And the motivation, in my opinion, shifts from doing it for altruistic reasons to more self-serving reasons. So I don't have a specific stance on that. I see both sides of that issue. I think, again, it's something that we need to discuss as a community. Sort of a tangent to that is, when should city council meetings be held, right? If you hold them in the middle of the day like we do now, it's limited perhaps to retirees or self-employed or folks that have a lot of flexibility in their schedules. I'm not suggesting that we change the meeting times, but if I know a lot of communities that have city council meetings or county commissioner meetings in afternoons or evenings, because it theoretically allows more involvement from folks that have daytime jobs. So I think that kind of dovetails with the discussion around city council pay and really who are we trying to focus on here and why.
Do you mind if I just follow up on that one real
Go
quick?
for it.
Do you have ideas outside of, if it's not raising pay, ways to make council more inclusive or more representative? Are there other ways to do that without, giving people a full-time job opportunity there?
That's a great question. I haven't really thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
Having served on several city boards and committees, I think part of how we could leverage more citizen involvement is being more intentional about those opportunities to serve as a volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we could figure out how to leverage more volunteer involvement, it may, to some degree, reduce the burden on city council.
Mm-hmm.
That might make it more attractive if meetings don't last 10 hours.
Mhm.
If the city council had more latitude to get at the root of a particular issue,
Mm-hmm.
maybe the lower time commitment might be a barrier that could be overcome more readily.
Okay. My next question, not related to pay, is public safety. The police department, Colorado Springs Police Department, short about 70 officers from its authorized strength. What do you do about the shortage of officers? And I guess in general, public safety, crime's gone up, traffic accidents have gone up. So what do we do about that?
Great question. Public safety, in my view, is one of the biggest issues that we face as a community. That's probably near the top of everyone's list. I don't have the magic bullet. I don't know that very many people do. I think figuring out how to get the message across to law enforcement that we support what they do, that we see the value in what they do, figuring out how to not only attract law enforcement, but retain law enforcement officers. That's been a big issue. I think one of the things that we've done as a community by having others sort of support structures, if you will, tasks that can be done by not just sworn officers helps, because then it reduces the burden on folks that first responders that have to respond to a major activity or criminal event or whatever you want to call it. So I think there's some strategies around that. I think looking at pay structures, other benefits that can be offered from a retention standpoint is pretty important. But as I said, I don't have that magic bullet. That's something that if I were elected, I would definitely try to dig into a little bit more. In my opinion, public safety is more than just criminal activity in law enforcement. In this region, again, having grown up here, I know the importance of everything from fire mitigation to evacuation routes to dealing with some of these windstorms that we've been dealing with in the last few years. I remember the good old days when we used to get massive blizzards that would shut down the city with 4 or 5 foot drifts. And so just being sort of aware of how public safety is more than just bar fights downtown, right?
Yeah.
Right. How do you propose to address the city's affordable housing crisis?
So affordable housing, in my view, is driven largely by diversity and development. So when this kind of goes back to the conversation about annexation and utilities and all that sort of thing, I think we have to be really smart about growth. I think we have to really balance it. But the more opportunities we have to create housing, obviously it's a market-driven issue. So if housing is restricted, the price goes up. if we're able to create more housing and maybe more diversity in housing types, that helps. Unfortunately, we've got some state issues relative to condominiums and the legal issues surrounding those types of developments. And until some things change at the state level, I think we're going to be looking at some more creative opportunities like the additional dwelling unit topic that we just discussed. But again, I think it's a balance of smart growth that will allow the market to create some affordability there.
If you're elected, do you foresee asking voters for new taxes or fees? And if so, for what purpose?
I tend to land on the side of limited government growth. I think it's important, certainly at the local level, for local government to focus on key infrastructure that only government can provide. So public safety, transportation, utility infrastructure, all of the things that we've been talking about. And so in that vein, I don't personally see the need or the benefit in additional tax measures or things of that nature. That said, if it were apparent that there was some missing piece to fund infrastructure, then I would certainly consider that. I think we've made some really smart moves over the last few years in that vein, right? 2C, I think, has been really important in terms of city road infrastructure. 10 years ago, I served on the PPRTA2 campaign, and I believe strongly in what that does for regional transportation and road improvements. I think what we are doing in terms of stormwater management, of course, we didn't have much choice because of the lawsuits and some of the issues surrounding that. But it's those key and core services that I think need to be supported by a tax base. Anything beyond that, I guess I would have to strongly consider it. I'll throw parks in that same category. I mean, Colorado Springs is known for our parks and our open space, and we've got a great program in TOPS. But really, again, beyond just kind of those core services, I would have to think long and hard about a tax initiative.
Julie?
All right, thanks. You may be aware of the League of Women Voters lawsuit against the city with Colorado Latinos Vote, Citizens Project, and the Black and Latino Leadership Coalition. And it's to move municipal elections to the fall, not necessarily during a presidential or gubernatorial year, but preferably the same time as school board elections, in hopes of increasing minority voter turnout and saving the city money. What are your thoughts on the lawsuit?
I'm aware of the discussion about aligning city elections with a different election cycle. I apologize. I'm not familiar with the lawsuit. I'm not familiar with the specifics of it. So beyond the idea of changing the election cycle, I can't comment.
So as a follow-up, would you see benefit to moving the election to the fall, or have any, if elected, would you promote that idea?
I would be very interested in studying that idea because, again, I'm not familiar in great detail. I think with coordinated elections, there's often a cost savings to the municipalities involved. I think if it would drive cost savings and be allow more participation from the voter base, of course, I would be interested in studying that. I don't know enough about it to say whether it would actually drive more voters, but worth considering for sure.
Okay, thank you. Brian?
Neighbors have asked for more detailed, neighbors being voters, residents of the city have asked for more detailed emergency evacuation planning, especially as it relates to wildfire. You touched on that a little bit. Is this something you would consider addressing as a city councilor?
I think it's largely in the purview of city staff and emergency management experts. I am not an expert in emergency management. I've worked with a lot of first responders in a lot of other ways. So I think it's a critical issue. I don't know, again, what the right answer is, but it's, in my view, absolutely worth studying. I know when evacuation routes were recently discussed, it was a pretty contentious issue. So it's something that we definitely need to talk about as a community, but what that looks like, I don't have the answers.
Okay. We are in the final third of this interview. So, Julie, I'll go ahead and let you ask the rest of the league's questions.
Well, I think I covered our specific questions,
Okay.
but we did not address the homelessness issue.
Yep.
So if that's all right,
Absolutely.
Brian, how would you address the homelessness issue?
Again, I don't have a silver bullet for that. It's a complex community discussion, and it really involves a lot of different moving parts. I was at an event this morning where Dr. Leon Kelly, our coroner, was talking about the rise in violence and homicides in the homeless community. I think, he talked a lot about the root causes being drug abuse, mental illness, and a lot of just the underlying issues that they're dealing with. I think figuring out how we can tackle those underlying issues as opposed to just putting a Band-Aid on the biggest concerns that are in our face is really critical. And the region has made some good progress in that regard. You hear these statistics about more people reaching out for mental health related issues and more, more kids being checked into Cedar Springs and things like that. And a lot of the media tries to kind of put a spin on it that that's not a good thing. I think it's a great thing. I think the more mental health services that people are seeking hopefully gets at the root of the issue. In terms of how to deal with the homeless population, again, as a community, I think we're doing pretty well. If you look at how other communities have dealt with it or not dealt with it, we have a relatively small population. I think we've got a lot of services in place to try to address the issues that they're facing. And I think more of just a mindful approach is what we need. We need to be compassionate, and we need to try to assist these folks however we can as a community.
Right.
We have a little more time, so I'll ask one more before we have you wrap up. And you talked about parks real briefly. Maybe you could go into some more detail. How should the city fund the needs of the park system?
Great question. I mean, there are obviously a lot of different mechanics out there, TOPS being one. I think, again, it's like many of these other topics, it's about being intentional and studying the issues and studying what we're trying to achieve, and working sort of backwards from there. To me, one of the beauties of parks and open space in Colorado Springs, it's one of the things that has drawn a lot of folks to our community. So the preservation of that type of space, the ability to continue improving some of the properties that are already in our portfolio. The city, I know, is looking at acquiring other open space and maintaining other areas that are gems for our community. I think funding mechanisms that are there are largely effective, but there may be some other ways that we can leverage either some state funds or some other avenues. And it's a critical piece to the quality of life that we all enjoy here.
Julie, did you have any other questions?
I think I've asked our
All
lead
you
questions.
got? All right.
Yeah.
Did you want to take a couple minutes and just sort of sum up why you're running and why voters should vote for you?
Again, I don't have I had a neighbor just recently say, kind of suspiciously, what's your agenda? And it took me aback because although I have a lot of issues that I think are important, I don't have an agenda. I don't have, some special interest thing that I'm trying to accomplish. I've grown up here. This is where I live. This is where my family lives. I have a 13-year-old daughter I'd like to leave a legacy for. My parents live here. I live and breathe this community every day. I want to take care of my staff at my firm. Ways that I can do that is by giving back to the community and being involved in the issues and hopefully, again, making some smart decisions, building some consensus, finding some paths forward that maybe not everybody completely agrees with, but that they can live with. And I feel like this is just, as I said before, a very pivotal point in our city's trajectory. And if we make some good decisions, we can keep moving forward. If we make some questionable ones, I'd hate to see us return to a point where we're turning off street lights and getting rid of trash cans in parks. So,
all right. Well, thank you, Brian, for joining us. You've been watching or listening to a joint podcast effort by Sixty35 Media and the League of Women Voters of the Pikes Peak Region.
Be sure to follow Making Democracy Work and check out lwvppr.org for more information regarding our candidate forums in March.
And continue to follow Sixty35 Vote to make sure your vote is an informed one. This podcast is produced by Dave Gardner, video directed by Nick Raven. I'm Brian Grossman, executive editor.
And I'm Julie Ott with the League of Women Voters. See you next time.
Hi, I'm Dave Gardner.
And I'm Nick Raven.
We're the podcast producers here at 6035 Media.
6035 Vote is just one of a growing family of hyperlocal podcasts that we're creating.
And these are for you, someone who wants to engage fully in your community.
We've got the 6035, which is a quick, lively recap of the top news stories of the week.
It's my favorite. It's really great and often funny.
I love having you as a guest, actually.
I do too.
And then we have Hot Takes and Streaming Breaks, which is a potpourri of news and commentary about movies, gaming, TV streaming, and just so much more. It's for the youthful at heart, and that could be anyone, really.
Yeah, I'm surprised I even really enjoy it because Nick hosts that, and he's witty.
Well, and the cool thing is that you can watch both of these podcasts on YouTube.
Or you can listen to them on the go in your favorite podcast app.
And there's a couple more, but you can also visit 6035media.org/podcast to see them, browse them, sample them.
And then subscribe to the ones that you like.
And then subscribe to this YouTube channel.
Yeah. And if you really love it all, like we do, you can just subscribe to the 6035 Podcast Network podcast, which is a conglomeration of all the episodes, all the brilliance and humor that emanates from the studio.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of it. So like and subscribe today and go listen to them all or watch them.
What he said. Good. Thanks.
Got it?
That wasn't so painful.